In the autumn of 2019, a survey crew clearing a pipeline right-of-way in the Cheat River country of West Virginia drove a steel probe into the ground and heard it ring against stone. They were more than 3 miles from the nearest road, deep in a hollow the map still would not name, and the stone they had struck was not a boulder. It had been cut and squared and fitted so tightly to the stones around it that the men could not slide a pocket knife into the seam. When they cleared away the leaf mould and the wet black soil above it, they found a wall, then a doorway with a lintel made of a single dressed slab, then a stair going down into ground that had no business holding a stair at all. And at the bottom of that stair, on a floor made of the same impossible stone, they found 9 people, a family, grandparents, parents and children, the smallest of them no more than 4 or 5 years old. Their bones had waited more than 120 years in the dark for someone to come down those steps, and every last one of them had been laid out facing the same blank wall, arranged with a care that no collapse and no animal could ever explain. They had been placed there, made to face it, as if someone had wanted them to keep watching something long after their eyes were gone. The old families in the valley had a name for that hollow, though they would not say it to a stranger, and they did not much like to say it to each other. They called it the Brackwell place, and for 4 generations they had gone out of their way to pretend it was not there. Now here is the thing that turned a strange find in the woods into something the state of West Virginia would spend the next 2 years trying to bury all over again. The wall those 9 people had been set to face was older than the family that died in front of it. It was older than the county. It was older, by every test that came back from every lab that ever touched it, than the notion that anyone had lived in these mountains at all. Someone built that room before the history books say there was a single soul here to build it, and the Brackwells, whoever they truly were, had spent their whole lives living on top of it. This is the story of what happened in that hollow in the winter of 1894. It is the story of a family that vanished from the record so completely that the county tax rolls simply skipped their name, as if a hand had reached back through time and lifted them clean out of it. And it is the story of what a modern crew pulled up out of the ground more than a century later, and why almost every man who stood at the top of that stair walked off the job and would never speak of it again. Before we go one step deeper, I want you to do one small thing for me. Look up from your screen for a moment and think of the oldest building in the place where you live, the stone church that nobody can quite date, the old courthouse with the strange half-sunken lower floor, the foundation that was already old and green with moss when your grandparents were children. Picture it, then go down into the comments and type where you live and what that building is. Leave it there and keep it in the back of your mind as we go, because by the time we reach the bottom of that stair with the Brackwell family, I promise you are going to look at that old building in your town a little differently. Type it now, and then stay with me, because this only gets stranger from here. The foreman on the crew that autumn was a man named Del Prater, a heavy equipment operator who had spent 30 years cutting right-of-way through half the counties in the state. He was not a superstitious man. When the probe rang against the stone, his first thought was money, because a boulder that size meant a change order and a lost afternoon, and he was already behind. So he sent 2 of his men down with shovels to find the edge of it so they could work out how much rock they were going to have to break. They never found an edge. That was the first thing that was wrong. They found a straight line of mortarless joints running off in both directions under the leaves, and the more they dug, the longer that line got. By the end of the first day they had uncovered the better part of a wall standing to the height of a grown man, made of blocks so large that Prater could not imagine how anyone had set them there without machines. There were no machines in that hollow. There was no road into that hollow. There was barely a deer trail. By law, when a crew turns up anything that looks like a grave or an old structure, the work stops and the county gets a call. Prater made the call that evening, more annoyed than curious, and within a week the site had passed out of his hands and into the hands of a forensic anthropologist from the state university named Dr. Marion Kessler, who arrived expecting to spend a single afternoon confirming that somebody had found an old root cellar and a family plot. She stayed for 4 months. What Kessler and her students uncovered over that autumn and into the first snows was not a cellar, and it was not a cabin. It was a structure that had been standing whole, and then had been buried whole, its lower story swallowed by soil that had risen around it the way silt rises around a sunken thing. She had seen something like it before in her fieldwork, buildings whose ground floors sat below the modern grade, doorways you had to stoop and step down into, and she had always been handed the ordinary explanations, the slow lift of earth across the centuries, the flood deposits, the way old towns quietly bury themselves. But she had never seen it this deep, and she had never seen masonry like this, and she had certainly never seen what was waiting at the bottom of it. The 9 bodies lay in a single long room with that one blank wall at its head. The room had been sealed, not fallen in, not caved over, but sealed, the doorway at the top of the stair packed tight with the same dressed stone, fitted into place from the inside. Whoever closed that room had closed it while they were still within it. There was no other way out that anyone has ever found. The bones told a story that the students did not like to say out loud. The adults had been arranged, kneeling, or had been placed to look as though they knelt, all of them turned toward the wall. The children were set among them in the same posture, small hands folded, small faces lifted, and on the floor, in front of the wall, worn down into the stone itself, were long, shallow grooves, as if for a great many years, long before that family ever came, something had knelt in that exact spot and pressed itself forward against the rock again and again and again until it wore the stone away. In the far corner of the room, sealed inside a tin box gone soft and orange with rust, Kessler found a ledger. The paper had survived because the box had survived, and the box had survived because the dry, sealed dark had never once been broken. It was a household book, the kind a farm family kept for generations, births and deaths, and the price of salt and the tally of who lived beneath the roof. The last full entry had been made in the December of 1894, and in that entry, in a careful steady hand, the head of the household had written out every living soul on the Brackwell place by name. There were 10 names. Kessler counted the bodies again. She counted them a third time. She had 2 of her students count them, separately, without telling them the number she expected. 9. 9 bodies in a sealed room, 9 people set kneeling before a wall that should not exist, and a ledger in the corner written in the last weeks of their lives that plainly, clearly, in that same steady hand, counted 10. One of them was not in that room. One of them had written that ledger, sealed that door from the inside, arranged the other 9 to face the wall, and then, somehow, was not among the dead. Before we move on to the Brackwells themselves, stop for a second. What you just heard about those 9 bodies and the wall they were facing is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the full account, the one the county sealed for 100 years. The 10th name, the empty place. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. To understand who died in that room, you have to go back almost 50 years before the killing, to the first time the name Brackwell appears anywhere in the county record. And even that first appearance is strange, because of where it shows up and where it does not. There is a land grant, filed in the county seat in the spring of 1841, that deeds a little more than 600 acres of ridge and hollow to a man named Elias Brackwell. That much is ordinary. Men were taking up mountain land all through those years. What is not ordinary is the way the grant describes the parcel. It sets the boundary as running along, and I am giving you the exact words of the deed here, the old works. Not a creek or a ridge line or a neighbour's corner post, but the old works themselves. As if there were already something built on that land in 1841 that every man filing the paper understood without asking, some structure so established, so plainly there, that it could serve as a boundary marker, and nobody felt the need to explain what it was. No survey from that period shows any settlement in that hollow. No road led to it. The nearest town, a rough little place called Gethsemane that sat where 2 creeks came together, was a full day's walk to the east, and the people of Gethsemane in 1841 would have told you that nobody lived up in that hollow and nobody ever had, because the ground was wrong and the water tasted of iron and the game would not stay there. And yet the deed is plain. The old works, Elias Brackwell did not build them. He came to live beside something that was already ancient. Where he came from, no one could ever say. He did not arrive on any road that anyone remembered. He was simply there one spring a tall, spare man with a wife who spoke to no one, and a wagon with no team that anybody in Gethsemane had ever sold him. He paid for his supplies with old coin, foreign coin, heavy silver pieces stamped with letters the storekeeper could not read and figures he did not recognize, and the storekeeper took them anyway, because the silver in them was true and heavy and worth more than the paper money of the day. Elias asked no help and offered no friendship. When the men of the town, curious and a little afraid, followed the ridge up toward his holler to see what a man could possibly want with ground like that, they found the way turned them around, not blocked, turned. They would set out climbing with the sun on their left and find themselves walking back down with the sun on their left again, and not one of them could tell you at what point along the trail he had changed his mind, only that he had, and that he did not care to try a second time. So the Brackwells were left alone, which seems to be exactly what everyone in this story wanted. And they prospered. That is the part that gnawed at Gethsemane for half a century. A family that took no help and worked ground that would have starved anyone else grew fat and healthy up in that hollow. Their apples came in heavy when the frost had killed every other orchard in the valley. Their stock never sickened. Their well never went dry in the droughts that cracked the creek beds down below. When Elias came down to trade, twice a year and never more, he brought honey and cured meat and wool of a quality the storekeeper could not match from anywhere else in the region, and he brought that old heavy coin, always the old coin, and he never once brought a complaint or a piece of gossip or a single word about his family. He was courteous, he was cold as a well stone, and every soul in Gethsemane was quietly, deeply relieved when he turned his back at last and started up the ridge for home. The Brackwell family grew, but it did not grow the way families grow. Elias and his silent wife had children of their own, that much the ledger would later confirm, but there were always more young ones on that place than the two of them could ever have accounted for. Bound children, orphans. In those years the crowded cities in the east were shipping their unwanted young out west by the trainload, whole cars full of children with no people and no place, handed down at every station, stopped to whoever would take them for their labour. And it seems that Elias Brackwell took them. He would meet the trains at a depot 2 counties over, the depot on the line that ran west out of Baltimore, and he would come back up the ridge with one more child, or 2 more, thin, pale, silent children who had no name that anyone knew and not one living person in the world to ask after them. That was allowed then. That was even praised then. A man who took in orphans was doing a Christian thing, and if he took in more of them than most, well, he had the land and the food and the endless need for hands. But here is what the depot agent finally noticed, decades later, when a state investigator sat him down and made him think it through. Elias Brackwell took children up that ridge for close to 30 years, and in 30 years, not one of those children ever came back down. They did not grow up and leave to find work in the towns. They did not marry into Gethsemane families. They did not turn up at church, or at market, or at any of the small gatherings where mountain people learned each other's faces across a whole lifetime. They went up the ridge, small and pale and quiet, and the mountain closed over them, and that was the end of it. The people of Gethsemane told themselves the children were being cared for. They told themselves that for 30 years, because the only other choice was to climb a ridge that turned grown men around and ask a cold, silver-eyed stranger what exactly he had done with a train's worth of children that nobody in the wide world would ever miss. And no one was ever willing to do that. It is easy, from where we sit now, to call those people cowards. But you did not have to stand at the foot of that ridge and feel the whole slope of it lean quietly away from you. They did. So what was Elias Brackwell doing with all of them? For a very long time, the only answer anybody had was the answer they all feared, and none of them would say out loud. But the ledger, the one in the rusted tin box, gives up a piece of the truth, and the piece it gives up is somehow worse than the fear. The ledger is not only a farm book. In among the honest tallies of salt and wool and the prices of 1860 and 1870, there are other entries, and those other entries begin in Elias's careful hand and then continue, across the decades, in different hands that must have belonged to his sons and then to his grandsons, because the family kept that one record running for 3 full generations. And the other entries are all about the wall, about the old works, about the thing the family had come to live beside, and had, across 50 patient years, come to serve. Because that is what the Brackwells were. They were never really settlers. The farm was never the point of them. The farm was the cover, the good ordinary reason for the world to leave them alone up there. What the Brackwells truly were, across 3 generations, was a family of keepers. They kept the old works. They kept whatever it was that knelt at the bottom of that stair and wore its long grooves down into the solid stone. And the children, all those pale, silent children off the trains, the children who went up the ridge and never once came back down, they were part of the keeping too. The ledger never says exactly how. Even in the sealed dark, even at the very end, the hand that wrote it was careful never to set the worst thing down plainly on the page. But it counts. It always counts. And the counts do not add up to a family that was only farming apples. Elias Brackwell died, the ledger says, in the autumn of 1868, an old man by then. There is no grave for him anywhere on that hillside. The family did not bury him in the ground the way mountain families buried their dead. The ledger notes his passing in a single flat line, and then, 3 days later, notes that the works were fed, and moves on. Whatever that meant, his son did it, and the arrangement did not so much as pause. The son was named Absalom Brackwell, and by every scrap we have, he was worse than his father, though worse is a hard word to measure across so much silence. Where Elias had been cold and correct, Absalom was watchful and hungry. He came to Gethsemane less often, and when he came he stayed less time, and the storekeeper who dealt with him in those middle years told his own children, much later, that Absalom Brackwell had a way of looking at a person as though he were pricing them, as though he were weighing what they might be good for, up the ridge, in the dark, at the bottom of a stair. The children kept coming off the trains. The mountain kept closing over them, and the apples kept coming in heavy while everyone else's orchards died. There was a peddler, in the summer of 1879, a talkative, confident man who came through Gethsemane selling tin and cloth and patent cures, and who laughed out loud at the warnings the town gave him, and announced that he would go up and sell to the Brackwells, since a family that rich and that private surely wanted for things. He started up the ridge on a bright morning with his pack and his mule. The mule came back down alone 2 days later, its pack cut away, standing at the edge of town at first light, and trembling so hard it could not be led. The peddler was never seen again, in that county or in any other, and the people of Gethsemane did not send anyone up to look for him, because they already knew, the way you know a thing you have refused to say for 40 years, that there was no looking to be done. Absalom Brackwell died in 1891, and the keeping, the whole terrible circle of it, passed at last to his son, the youngest of the line, the man who would write that final ledger, seal that door from the inside, and set his own family kneeling before the wall. His name was Ansel Brackwell, and unlike his father and his grandfather, Ansel Brackwell was not born cold. Something in him, at the very end, broke, and when it broke, it did not just kill his family. It cracked open the whole circle that had held that holler shut for 50 years, and everything the Brackwells had spent 3 generations keeping came loose in a single winter. To understand what Ansel did, and why a man raised to the keeping would turn on it, we have to look at the winter it all came apart, and at the thing his family had been feeding for longer than anyone in that valley had been alive. But before we climb into that final winter, you deserve to know the true cost of the Brackwells' long comfort, because the ledger keeps that too, and it keeps it in a way that turns the stomach worse than almost anything else in this whole account. Remember that the ledger is a household book, and household books count. They count barrels of salt and bushels of apples and the head of stock that made it through the winter, because counting is how a farm family knows whether it will live. And somewhere in Elias Brackwell's cold and orderly mind, the children off the trains were entered into the same book, in the same columns, in the same steady hand, as everything else the place took in and used up. That is the part that is hard to read. Not rage, not cruelty, nothing so human as hatred, just an accounting. So many taken in this year, so many kept, so many given to the works. Balanced, every season, like the salt and the wool. The children were not born on the ridge, most of them. They came from the crowded eastern cities, from the orphanages and the poorhouses and the tenements that could not feed them, swept up by the placement societies of that era and loaded onto the westbound trains by the hundreds. It was called finding them homes. In practice, it meant standing rows of frightened children on a platform at each stop and letting the local farmers look them over, feel their arms for strength, check their teeth, and take the ones that looked like they could work. A child with no people had no protection and no voice, and no one to write a letter when the follow-up visit never came. The whole system ran on the quiet understanding that these were children the world had already decided not to want. And a man who wanted children that the world had already agreed to forget could not have designed a better supply if he had built the railroad himself. The ledger names some of them. Not many, and never fully, but some. And the names are the worst part, because a name is the one thing that makes a number back into a child. There is a girl entered only as Little Pearl, taken in the autumn of 1859, kept through one winter, and gone from the columns by the spring. There is a boy called Tobias, who lasted almost 2 years, long enough that Elias began entering small notes about his usefulness with the stock before the notes stop and the accounting moves on. There is an entry, in the summer of 1873, for 2 brothers taken together off the same train, and a line, some weeks later, noting that the works had been given the elder and that the younger had been kept back for the season, and you can feel, even across 150 years and a stranger's careful hand, the arithmetic of a family deciding which brother would live a little longer. And there is one child the outside world very nearly caught, and this is the thread that would matter in the end. Somewhere back east, in the machinery of one of the placement societies, there was a clerk. History does not give us the clerk's name, only the trail the clerk left. This was a person whose whole job was paperwork, the follow-up cards and the confirmation letters that the societies required in order to prove that the children they scattered across the country were still alive and cared for. It was tedious work, and most who did it carelessly, and the missing cards from a poor county in the mountains would ordinarily have vanished into the vast indifference of a system that never truly wanted to know. But this one clerk was careful. This one clerk noticed, card after card, year after year, from a single family in a single mountain county, never came back. There were no confirmations coming back, and no visits ever logged, and no child from that family was ever written up as grown, or placed on again, or married, or buried. The children went to that address, and the paper simply stopped, the way a road stops at the edge of a cliff. A careless clerk sees nothing in that. A careful clerk feels the cold place open in the pit of the stomach. This clerk started a file, and kept it, and added to it, patiently, across years, until the file was thick enough that someone above had to be shown, and the file is the reason the state of West Virginia eventually sent a thorough man named Harlan Cobb up into those mountains in 1895. We will come to Cobb, and to what the world did to his thoroughness. But hold on to this now, because it is the quiet heart of the whole story. The Brackwells were caught, in the end, not by anyone who feared them, not by any brave soul who climbed the ridge, not by the law or the church or the neighbours who had looked away for 50 years. They were caught by a bureaucrat who would not let the missing cards go. They were caught by counting. The one weapon that finally found its way up that ridge was the same weapon Elias Brackwell had used to damn all those children in the first place. Somebody, at last, added it up. How many children went up that ridge across 3 generations and never came down? The ledger does not give a clean total, because the ledger, in its last years, grows evasive about the very thing it exists to record, as though even a family of keepers could not bear to sum it. Kessler tried to estimate it from the entries she could read and the years she could bracket, and the number she arrived at she would only ever describe as in the dozens, many dozens, across half a century, and she said that saying it more precisely than that felt like a cruelty to children who had already been reduced to columns once and did not deserve to be reduced to a statistic a second time. Dozens of children, with names like Pearl and Tobias, taken off trains and carried up a ridge that turned grown men around, and fed, one at a time, over 50 patient years, to something waiting at the bottom of a stair. That was the price of the apples that came in heavy when every other orchard died. That was the price of the well that never went dry, and the stock that never sickened, and the old heavy foreign silver that Elias laid on the storekeeper's counter twice a year. Every good thing on the Brackwell place was bought with a child that the world had already agreed to forget. The family did not think of it as murder any more than they thought of the harvest as murder. It was keeping. It was the bargain. It was simply how their world worked. And it worked. and it kept working. Right up until the winter, one keeper looked at one small girl and could not make the columns balance anymore. To understand what those children were given to, and what it did to earn the name the Old Works, we finally have to go down the stair ourselves and look at the thing the Brackwells spent 3 generations serving. Let me tell you what the Old Works were, as far as anyone has ever been able to piece it together, because everything that happened in that final winter turns on it. When Dr. Kessler finished clearing the buried structure, she found that the sealed room with the 9 bodies was only one small chamber at the end of something much larger. The stair the pipeline crew stumbled onto led down into a whole complex of rooms and passages, all of it built from the same seamless dressed stone, all of it far below the modern ground and deeper still below the level where any settler cabin would ever have stood. The walls ran on into the hillside farther than her team ever fully mapped, because past a certain point the air changed, and her students, one after another, refused to go in. The masonry matched nothing. That is not a figure of speech. Kessler sent photographs and measurements to colleagues across the country, and no one could name the technique, the tools, or the tradition. The blocks were too large, too precisely cut, too perfectly joined, and they showed no marks of any chisel or saw she could identify. The style was not native to those mountains. It was not colonial. It was not anything that belonged in the record of North America at all. And when she had the mortar tested, the little there was of it, and then had samples of the stone itself dated by the surrounding deposits, the numbers came back so old, so far outside anything reasonable, that the first lab assumed contamination and threw the results away. The second lab did not throw them away. The second lab called her on the telephone and asked her, very carefully, whether she was certain about where the samples had come from. This was the Old Works, a buried complex older than the settlement of the continent, sitting under a holler that the maps refused to name, and a family had come out of nowhere in 1841 to live on top of it and tend it like a farm. And at the very heart of it, in that end chamber, was the wall. The blank wall the 9 bodies faced. The wall with the worn grooves at its foot. Kessler could find no door in it, no seam, no opening of any kind. It was simply the end of the place, a flat expanse of that impossible stone, and yet everything in the complex was oriented toward it, every passage bending and sloping and narrowing until it delivered you, at last, to your knees in front of that one blank face of rock. The whole buried structure was built to point at it, and the Brackwells, for 50 years, had spent their lives, and other people's lives, kneeling there. The ledger will not say what lived behind the wall, or under it, or in it. But the ledger records the feeding, and from the feeding you can work out the shape of the thing, the way you can work out the shape of an animal from the tracks it leaves. In the early years, in Elias's process, the feeding was livestock and game, and the ledger implies without ever saying, the peddlers and the drifters and the lost travellers who wandered up the ridge and were never turned around in time. But as the years went on, the feeding demanded more, and it demanded a particular kind of more. It wanted the children. It wanted them young, and it wanted them unclaimed, children with no name and no people, because a child that no one would ever come looking for was a child the world would never miss, and a thing that eats in secret needs above all else to never be missed. That is why the orphan trains. That is why 30 years of pale, silent children up a ridge that no one ever came back down. The Brackwells were not cruel for the sake of cruelty. They were keepers, and the works were hungry, and the arrangement kept them fat and hidden and safe. That was the bargain. It had always been the bargain. Now, you may be wondering how a whole holler and a whole family and 30 years of missing children could simply drop out of history without anyone in authority ever noticing. And the answer to that is its own kind of horror, because it did not happen by accident. It was helped along. When Kessler tried to reconstruct the paper trail of that holler, she found that it had been methodically emptied. The federal census that should have counted the Brackwells in 1850 and 1860 and 1870 skips them. Not with a blank, with a seam. The enumerator's route runs up the valley, and where the Brackwell holler should fall, the page numbers jump and the household count does not add up, as though a leaf had been lifted out of the book and the remaining pages pressed back together by someone who hoped no one would ever hold the volume up to the light. The county tax rolls do the same. The land grant of 1841 exists, but every record that should follow from it, every assessment, every payment, every transfer, is simply absent, as if the 600 acres had been quietly agreed by everyone with a pen to not exist. Somebody, across decades, in offices 2 counties and then 2 states away, had been keeping the Brackwell place off the books, and the old heavy foreign silver that Elias and Absalom paid with, coin that no one could read and everyone accepted, may be the simplest explanation of all for how a clerk's memory could be made to skip a page. The hollow was erased on purpose, a little at a time, for 50 years, by hands the Brackwells never had to show themselves to. And that is the detail that ought to keep you up tonight, because it means the family in that hollow was not alone. It means the keeping was known. It means that somewhere down in the ordinary world of ledgers and land offices and census routes, someone else understood exactly what was up that ridge and chose, year after year, to help it stay hidden. Which brings us to the last generation, and to the winter everything came apart. Ansel Brackwell took over the keeping when his father Absalom died in the spring of 1891. By the ledger's own reckoning, the household that winter of 1893 going into 94 held 10 souls. There was Ansel himself, in his middle 30s. There was his wife, a woman the ledger names only as R, which may have been all the name she was ever given up on that ridge. There were his aged mother, Absalom's widow, and 2 of Ansel's own grown or half-grown children. And there were 4 of the bound children, the last 4 off the trains, ranging from a boy of perhaps 12 down to a girl the ledger lists as no more than 4 years old. 10 names, 10 souls. The number the county sealed away, and the number that did not match the 9 bodies in the room. Something was different about that last winter, and the difference is written all over the final pages of the ledger in the way the entries change. For 50 years the ledger had been a keeper's book, flat and dutiful. The works were fed, the stock did well, the price of salt. But starting in the deep cold of that winter, Ansel's entries begin to fray. The steady hand grows unsteady. The flat lines start to bend towards something like grief. He writes, at one point, that the works are asking more often now. He writes that they are asking out of turn. And then, in an entry Kessler said she could not read aloud to her students without stopping, he writes a single line about the youngest child, the little girl of 4, and that line makes it very clear that the works had asked for her, and asked for her next, and that Ansel Brackwell, keeper and son of keepers and grandson of keepers, had for the first time in the history of his family found something inside himself that said no. That no is the hinge on which this entire story turns. 3 generations of Brackwells had fed that wall without flinching, had walked a train's worth of children down into the dark, and come back up into the sunlight and eaten their heavy apples and slept sound. And then one man, over one small girl, in the worst winter that Holler had ever known, could not do it. He could not walk her down the stair, and in a place built entirely around the certainty that the keeper always would, that single failure of nerve was not mercy, it was a door coming open. It was the beginning of the end of everything, for the girl, for Ansel, for all 10 souls on that ridge, and for the fragile silence that had kept the works fed and hidden since before any of them were born. To feel the full weight of what Ansel did next, you have to understand what he believed was waiting if he refused. And the last outsiders ever to climb that ridge and come back down alive left us just enough to guess at it. The last outsiders to climb the Brackwell Ridge and come back down were 2 men from Gethsemane, a young preacher named Thomas Sill and a hunter named Cyrus Vance, and they went up in the January of 1894 for the plainest reason in the world. The valley had been hearing sounds. All that winter, on the cold, still nights when sound carries for miles across a frozen mountain, the people of Gethsemane had been hearing something come down off the ridge. Not wind, not any animal they knew, and those were men who knew every animal in those hills by its voice in the dark. It was a low sound, they said, a sound you felt in the floor of your chest before you heard it in your ears, and it came in slow, measured pulses, on and on for hours, always from the direction of the Brackwell place. Dogs would not settle when it came. Children woke crying, and it had been getting stronger, week by week, all winter long, as if whatever made it were coming closer to the surface, or as if the surface between it and the valley were wearing thin. Preacher Sill believed it was his duty to go. Cyrus Vance went because Sill could not be talked out of it, and no one should climb that ridge alone. What the two of them found up there, Vance told and retold for the rest of his long life, and it is the only first-hand account we have of the Brackwell place, while a Brackwell was still alive in it. The ridge did not turn them around. That was the first thing Vance noticed, and it frightened him more than being turned around ever would have. The old trick of the trail, the quiet lean of the slope that had sent men home confused for 50 years, was simply gone. The way up lay open. And an open way, Vance said, meant that whatever had been guarding its privacy no longer cared who came, because whatever was about to happen up there was past the point of being kept secret. They came out of the trees near dusk into a clearing they had not known was there, and in the clearing stood the Brackwell farmstead, and it was nothing like what the valley had imagined across all those decades. There was a house, a long, low house of that same strange, seamless stone, older than any house had a right to be. There were outbuildings. There was an orchard, black and bare in the January cold, and Vance swore that the apples still hung heavy and red on those black branches in the dead of winter, unfrozen, unspoiled, glistening, and that the sight of ripe fruit on a leafless tree in January was the moment he understood that he had walked out of the ordinary world entirely. And there was Ansel Brackwell standing in the yard as though he had been waiting for them, which perhaps he had. Vance described him as a man being eaten alive from the inside, not sick, not starving. The man was strong and well-fed like all his line, but hollowed, worn down to the wire. A man who had not slept in a very long time and did not expect to sleep again. He did not threaten them. He did not turn them away. He asked the preacher a single question, and the question was this. He asked whether a man who had done a great and terrible wrong for his whole life, and had been born to it, and raised to it, and had never known there was any other way to be, could still, at the very end, refused to do it one last time and be forgiven. And Preacher Sill, who did not yet understand what he was being asked, gave the answer a preacher gives. He said that no soul was ever beyond mercy if it truly turned. Vance said that Ansel Brackwell wept then, standing in the frozen yard with the impossible red apples hanging over him, wept the way a man weeps when he has just been handed the one thing he wanted and knows it has come far too late to save him. And then Ansel told them to go, told them the way downward was open now, and would not be open long, and that they must be off the ridge before full dark, and must never, ever come back up it, no matter what they heard, no matter who they thought they heard calling. He told them the works were awake. He told them that he had stopped the feeding, and that a thing which has been fed for 2,000 years does not simply go hungry and fall back asleep. It comes up looking. He told them that he meant to close it, to seal it back into the dark with everything and everyone the old bargain had built around it, and that this was the only ending left that he could give. The last thing Ansel Brackwell said to the two men from Gethsemane, as they backed away toward the trees, was to keep the valley away from the ridge for 100 years. 100 years, he said. After that it would have gone back to sleep, or it would have starved, or it would not matter any more who came. But for 100 years, keep them off. Vance and Sill went down the open trail in the failing light with that low pulse rising behind them out of the ground, and they did not once look back, and they reached the valley near midnight and told the story that would keep every soul in Gethsemane off that ridge for exactly the 100 years Ansel had asked for. Preacher Sill never spoke of it again, and left the county within the year, and by every account was never quite right afterward. Cyrus Vance stayed and talked, and it is because he talked that we know any of this at all. But even Vance would only tell it in daylight, and he adored an old man still sleeping with a lamp lit. Now think about the position Ansel Brackwell was in, alone up on that ridge in the last weeks of that winter, because everything he did next came out of it. He had refused the feeding. He had looked at a 4-year-old girl the works had asked for by name, and had found, for the first time in the history of his cold and careful family, that he would rather die than walk her down that stair. But refusing the feeding did not make the works go away. It only made them hungrier, and it woke them, and it started them rising toward the surface, toward the valley, toward every living thing in reach. 3 generations of Brackwells had kept that thing quiet by keeping it fed. Ansel had broken the only lever his family had ever held. and now the only thing left to him was to make sure that when the works came up looking for what they were owed, there was nothing there to find but a sealed door and a debt they could not collect. The ledger's final pages are Ansel working this out, night by freezing night, in a hand that shakes worse with every entry. He writes of trying to send the family down the ridge to safety, and of the ridge not letting them go, the old turning trick working in reverse now, walking them back up to the house every time they tried to leave, because the works would not release what the bargain had marked as theirs. He writes that the youngest ones had stopped speaking. He writes that his wife, the woman named only R, understood before he did what closing the works was going to cost, and that she did not run and did not weep, but sat with the children and made them ready. He writes one line, near the very end, that Kessler called the saddest thing she had ever read in a document, a line where Ansel says that he had spent his whole life believing his family were the keepers, the masters of the thing in the dark, and had understood only now, at the finish, that they had never been the keepers at all. They had been the herd, kept fat and healthy and breeding and safe, generation after generation, for the one purpose any herd is ever kept. And the moment one of them refused to go to the wall, the whole illusion of keeping fell away, and there was nothing left underneath it but the oldest arrangement there is, the arrangement between a hungry thing and the animals it has been raising to eat. Ansel Brackwell decided, in those last days, that if the works could not be starved and could not be fled, then they would be sealed, and that he would use the one thing the works still wanted, his family, his herd, the 10 marked souls of the Brackwell place, as the lock. He would give the works its due and take its due out of the world in the same act. He would bring them all down the stair one final time. But this time no one would be coming back up to farm the apples and meet the trains and keep the terrible circle turning. This time he would close the door from the inside, with all of them in the dark together, and let the debt and the debtors be sealed in the same tomb. What actually happened on the night he did it is written in the bones, and it is not quite the ending Ansel planned, because the ledger counts 10, and the room held 9. Here is what the evidence says happened on the ridge, on the longest night of that winter, the night the low pulse in the valley finally stopped. Dr. Kessler was a scientist, and she hated to guess, and she said many times that most of what follows is reconstruction, not proof. But she also said that the bones and the sealed door and the final entries in the ledger all told the same story when you laid them side by side, and that after 4 months in that hollow she had stopped being able to imagine any other way it could have gone. It was the deep dark of a December night, and the works had been rising for weeks. Whatever they were, the thing behind the wall had climbed close enough to the surface that its hunger was pressing up into the house itself, into the frozen yard, into the dreams of the children who had stopped speaking. Ansel Brackwell knew he could not hold it off another turn of the moon, so he gathered them, his mother, old and half blind by then, his wife, the woman named R, who had already made her peace and made the children ready, his own 2 half-grown children, and the 4 off the trains, the boy of 12, 2 others in between, and the little girl of 4, the one whose name the works had spoken, the one whose refusal had brought the whole world down around them. 9 of them, and Ansel, made 10. And the ledger's final full entry, the one written that very night, names all 10, and then says, in a hand barely holding together, that they would go down together and not come up, and that the door would be closed behind them, and that God, if he could still hear anything at the bottom of that place, should have mercy on the herd that had never once been given the chance to be anything else. He took them down the stair. That much the bones make plain, because that is where the bones were found, arranged in the end chamber before the wall. But arranged is the word that haunts this whole case, because the arrangement was not chaos, and it was not struggle. The 9 of them were laid out, kneeling, facing the wall, in careful order, oldest at the outside, and the small girl at the very centre, closest to the stone, in the exact spot where those long grooves had been worn into the floor by whatever knelt there before them across the uncounted years. They had not been dragged, they had not fought. They had knelt, or been knelt, in a still and patient row, and they had faced the wall, and they had waited. Kessler found no wounds on most of them. That is one of the hardest parts of this to sit with. On the older bones there were no cut marks, no fractures of struggle, no sign of the violence the word massacre makes you expect. They had simply died, kneeling, facing the stone, in good order, all together. What kills 9 people at once and leaves no mark is not a question forensic science is built to answer, and Kessler would not pretend to answer it. She would only say that whatever was behind that wall had been given its due at last, and that its due did not leave the kind of marks a knife leaves. But on 2 of the bodies there were marks. On the woman named R, and on the boy of 12, there were injuries, and the injuries told a smaller story inside the larger one. R had a broken forearm, the kind of break you get when you throw an arm up to stop something or to hold something back, and the boy of 12 had been struck, more than once, hard, at the base of the skull. Kessler thought, and said carefully that she only thought that near the end something had gone not according to plan. That in the last moments in that chamber, with the wall waiting and the works pressing close, someone had panicked, or resisted, or tried to save one of the others, and that R had thrown up her arm, and that the boy had been put down by force so that the arrangement could be completed. The massacre, if that is the word, was not the quiet kneeling death of the 9. The massacre was the handful of seconds in which the plan nearly broke and was held together by force so that the door could be sealed on a finished thing rather than a struggling one. And then there is the door itself, and the 10th name, and the empty place, and this is where the whole story bends into something no reconstruction can close. The doorway at the top of the stair was sealed from the inside. The dressed stones that filled it had been fitted into place by a hand working from within the chamber, packing the gap tight, blocking the only way out. Ansel meant to be the one to do it. The ledger says as much. He would close the works into the dark with all 10 of them inside, himself last, the keeper going down with the kept, the herd and the debt, and the herdsman sealed together forever. That was the plan. That was the ending he had chosen. 10 names, 1 tomb, 1 sealed door, and the low pulse in the valley silenced for good. But there were only 9 bodies in that room, and the door was sealed from the inside. And Ansel Brackwell was not among the dead. So work it through, the way Kessler worked it through, alone in that hollow as the snow came down. If the door was sealed from within, then someone was inside the chamber to seal it. If Ansel sealed it, Ansel was inside. But if Ansel was inside, where is his body? There is no 10th set of bones. There is no way out. The chamber is stone on every side, the wall unbroken, the ceiling sound, the sealed doorway, the only opening, and that opening packed shut from the inside by human hands. 10 went down, 9 remained. 1 sealed the door from within a stone room with no exit, and then was gone from that room as though he had walked out through the wall the others were made to face. Kessler had 3 explanations, and she did not fully believe any of them, and neither will you. The first is the ordinary one, the one she was supposed to prefer. Perhaps the ledger simply miscounted. Perhaps R and the mother and the children came to 9, including Ansel, and the 10th name was a bound child who died earlier that winter and was written in out of grief or habit. It is possible. It is what a careful scientist is meant to conclude. But Kessler had held that ledger, and she said the final entry named 10 living souls on that last night, in the present tense, in a hand that was counting the people it was about to lead down a stair, and that you do not miscount your own family in the last thing you will ever write. The second explanation is that someone else sealed the door, that the 10th name went down, watched the 9 of them kneel and die before the wall, and then climbed the stair and packed it shut from the inside and stayed down there in the dark, a 10th keeper for a sealed and silent works, and that his bones are somewhere in the deeper passages Kessler's students refused to enter, in the part of the complex where the air changed and no one would follow the walls to their end. That is the explanation that fits the physical evidence best, and it is the one that made her stop mapping the site. The third explanation is the one Cyrus Vance believed until the day he died, and it is the reason he slept with a lamp lit. Vance believed that Ansel Brackwell did exactly what he set out to do, that he brought his family down and sealed the works into the dark, and that the works took its due, and that its due included the keeper, not his life. Its due had never been about anything as small as a life. Vance believed the wall the 9 of them were made to face was not the end of the place but a door of its own, and that on the night the low pulse stopped, that door opened once, for one, and that whatever Ansel Brackwell walked through it to become is the reason his bones will never be found on this side of the stone. The 10th name did not die in that room. The 10th name went through the wall, and the empty place among the 9 is not an absence at all. It is a space left open, deliberately, in the last row of the herd, facing the stone, waiting to be filled by whoever comes down that stair and kneels where a keeper is supposed to kneel. Which is why what happened when a modern crew reopened that door, more than 100 years to the season after Ansel sealed it, matters so much more than a simple archaeological find ever should. First, though, we have to talk about the one time before Kessler that the outside world came close to the truth, because it tells you exactly what happens when someone official starts pulling on the Brackwell thread. In the spring of 1895, a few months after the low pulse stopped and the valley finally let itself believe the ridge had gone quiet, a state investigator came to Gethsemane. His name was Harlan Cobb, and he had not come about the Brackwells at all. He had come about the children. Somewhere in the machinery of the orphan placement societies back east, a clerk with an unusually careful mind had noticed that a great many children sent west on a particular line, across a great many years, had all been placed with a single family in a single county, and that not one of those placements had ever generated the follow-up paperwork the societies required. No child sent up that ridge was ever confirmed alive again, and the letters that should have followed each one simply never came back. Cobb was sent to close the file. He expected to find graves, or a fraud, or a sad ordinary story of a poor family in over its head. He was a thorough man, and thorough men are the ones this arrangement had always feared most. Cobb interviewed the depot agent, who told him about 30 years of children going up and none coming down. He interviewed the storekeeper, who told him about the old silver and the cold silver-eyed men. He interviewed Cyrus Vance, who told him, in daylight, with the lamp already lit against the coming dark, everything he had seen in the yard that January. And then Harlan Cobb did the thing no one in 50 years had been willing to do. He went up the ridge. He went up in April, with 2 deputies, and the trail did not turn them around, because there was no longer anything up there that cared to keep its privacy. They found the clearing and the long low house of impossible stone, and the black orchard where, Cobb wrote in his report, the apples had finally fallen and lay rotting red in the melting snow, unnatural even in their rotting. They found the outbuildings empty, and they found the stair open, and went down it, and found the sealed chamber, and broke the seal, and saw the 9 of them kneeling before the wall. Harlan Cobb wrote a full report. He counted the bodies. He copied out passages from the ledger, which was still in its tin box in the corner where Kessler would find it more than a century later. He described the wall and the grooves and the masonry that belonged to no century he knew. He described the 10th name and the empty place and the door sealed from the inside. He wrote it all down, plainly and carefully, the way a thorough man does, and he submitted it to the state, and he recommended a full excavation and inquiry. And then Harlan Cobb's report vanished. Not his conclusions, the document itself. It was logged into the state records in the autumn of 1895, and it was gone from them before the winter, and the only reason we know it ever existed is that Cobb, being the kind of man he was, had kept a private copy, and that copy passed down through his family and finally surfaced when Kessler, working the modern dig, went looking for anyone named Cobb in that part of the state. The family had kept it in a trunk for 4 generations. They had been told, by the old man himself, never to give it to the government, because the government was the one that had taken the first one. Harlan Cobb was reassigned that same winter to a post in the far west of the country, and he never worked another case in those mountains, and the orphan file he had been sent to close was closed by someone else, marked resolved, no further action. The Brackwell Hollow went back to being a place that did not exist on any map, and the 600 acres slept under their reforestation for another 100 years, almost exactly the 100 years Ansel Brackwell had asked the valley to give him. Someone, somewhere in the ordinary world of records and reassignments, had made sure of it. The same someone, or the same something, that had been skipping the census pages and losing the tax rolls since 1850. The keeping, it turns out, was never only up on the ridge. Part of it was always down in the offices, in the archives, in the quiet hands that make inconvenient pages disappear. And those hands did not stop working just because the family on the ridge had died. Which is what makes the modern chapter so hard to shake. When the pipeline crew broke ground in 2019, the 100 years were up. Ansell's 100 years, given to two frightened men in a frozen yard, had run out almost to the season, and whatever agreement had kept that holler hidden since the 1850s seems to have expired with it, because for the first time in a century and a half the Brackwell place let itself be found. The trail did not turn the crew around. The pages did not go missing fast enough. The stone rang under the probe, and the door came open, and Dr. Marion Kessler went down the stair that Harlan Cobb had gone down before her, and that Ansel Brackwell had sealed before them both. And this is where the record, the careful scientific record Kessler kept for 4 months, starts to come apart in exactly the way Cobb's report came apart, only slower and in front of witnesses. The dating came first. Kessler had the wall stone and the surrounding deposits tested by 2 independent laboratories, and both returned ages that were not merely old but impossible, ages that placed the cutting and setting of that masonry so far back that there should have been no hands on this continent to cut or set anything at all. The first lab, as I told you, assumed contamination and discarded the result. The second lab did not discard it. The second lab confirmed it, and then, within a matter of weeks, informed Kessler that the physical samples she had submitted had been lost in a transfer between facilities, and that without the samples the results could not be published, and that they would advise her, as colleagues, not to stake her reputation on numbers that could no longer be backed by material she could produce. The samples were simply gone, the same way Cobb's report was simply gone, the same way the census pages were simply gone, a pattern that old does not break just because the calendar rolls over to a new century. Then the crew began to leave. Kessler started that autumn with a full field team, graduate students, local hires, the pipeline men who stayed on to help move stone. By the deep of winter, almost none of them would go below ground. It was not one dramatic event that emptied the site. It was an accumulation of small things that each sounded foolish, said out loud, and together became something no one could work through. It was the way the air changed past a certain point in the passages. It was the way sound behaved wrong down there, footsteps arriving a half-second late, voices seeming to come from the wall the 9 of them faced. It was the way more than one person, working alone near that end chamber, felt with complete certainty that there was an empty place in the row of the dead that was meant for them, and felt themselves wanting, for just a moment, to go and kneel in it. Del Prater, the foreman, the unsuperstitious man who had started the whole thing by chasing a change order, walked off the job in November and told Kessler on his way out that he had spent 30 years underground in one form or another and had never once been afraid of the dark until that hollow, and that he was not coming back, and that if the state had any sense it would pour concrete down that stair and forget the coordinates. He would not shake her hand. He would not turn his back on the tree line as he left. By the end, Kessler was working the site nearly alone, which she knew was reckless and did anyway, because she was a scientist, and the answer was right there behind a wall she could touch. And it is the last stretch of her own notes, the private ones, not the official record, that give this whole story its final turn and its warning. Dr. Kessler kept 2 records that autumn and winter. There was the official one, the field notes, and the measurements and the careful language meant for the university and the state, the record that was slowly being emptied out from under her by lost samples and discarded results. And there was the other one, a plain paper notebook she carried in her coat, in which she wrote the things she could not put in the first record without ending her own career. It is that second notebook that her family released years later, after she had left the field entirely and would no longer speak about the Brackwell place to anyone, not even to them. The private notebook is where the scientist and the thing she had dug up finally meet, and it does not read like the others. It gets shorter as it goes, and stranger, and toward the end the careful measuring voice gives way to something closer to Ansel Brackwell's shaking hand in the last pages of the ledger, as though the place does that to whoever spends too long at the bottom of it. She writes, early on, about the grooves in the floor before the wall, and about counting them, and about realizing that they were not random wear but the record of a posture, the same body kneeling in the same place, pressing forward against the same stone, for so long and so many times that it had carved itself into rock. She calculated, roughly, How many years of kneeling it would take to wear a groove like that into stone of that hardness. She wrote the number down and then crossed it out, because the number was longer than the family had been on the ridge, longer than the settlement of the continent, longer than she was willing to see written in her own hand. Something had knelt before that wall for far longer than the Brackwells. The Brackwells were only the most recent keepers of a post that had been kept by someone, by something, since before there was a history to keep it in. She writes about the wall itself, and about the certainty that grew in her the longer she worked near it, that it was not solid the way stone is solid, that it was a face rather than an end, and that on the far side of it there was a volume of space she could not account for in her mapping of the hillside, a hollow the hill should not have been able to contain. She stopped taking measurements near the wall. She does not fully say why. She only writes that the tape measure gave different lengths on different days, and that she did not trust what the numbers were beginning to tell her about the size of the thing the whole complex bent itself toward. And she writes, in the last entries, about the empty place. She had felt it too. The thing the crew felt, the thing that drove them up the stair and off the job and out to their cars without looking back. In the row of the 9 kneeling dead, with the small girl at the centre closest to the stone, there was a gap, a space in the arrangement at the outer end where a 10th kneeling body should have completed the pattern and did not. Ansel's place, the keeper's place, and Kessler wrote that the longer she worked alone in that chamber, the more that empty place stopped feeling like an absence and started feeling like an invitation. She would look up from her work and find that she had been staring at it. She would come back to herself kneeling, not remembering having knelt, her own body drawn into the shape the family had been set into, facing the wall, waiting, the way you wait for something you cannot name but have somehow always known was coming. She wrote that the wall was patient. She wrote that it had waited 2,000 years for the feeding to resume, and that it did not particularly care whether the next one to kneel came down the stair as a keeper or as a scientist, because to the thing behind the stone those were the same thing, a warm and living animal that had found its way to the appointed place. She wrote that Ansel Brackwell had been right about everything except the shape of the mercy. He thought he had sealed the works into the dark forever. What he had actually done was leave the door propped open by one empty space, a single vacancy in the last row of the herd, held ready across 100 years for whoever finally came back down and could not stop themselves from filling it. The last entry in Kessler's private notebook is a single line, written in a hand that no longer looks like the hand at the start. It says that she was going to seal it herself, that she was going to do what Prater had told her to do and what Ansel had done before her, that she would close the stair and lose the coordinates and never publish a word, because some things are found so that they can be lost again on purpose, and because the only correct response to an empty place that wants you to kneel in it is to make certain no one ever stands where they can feel it call. She did close it. The state, quietly and with no explanation the public ever received, backfilled the site in the spring of 2020 and let the forest take it, and the official position today is that the pipeline survey turned up an unremarkable 19th century homestead and a family cemetery. Nothing more, a matter closed. The samples are gone, the reports are thin. Marion Kessler left the field and does not discuss it. And the Brackwell Holler has gone back, once more, to being a place that does not appear on any map, kept off the record by hands that have been keeping it off the record for 170 years and show no sign of ever stopping. So let me bring you back, now, to the thing I asked you at the very beginning. I asked you to think of the oldest building in the place where you live, the stone church nobody can date, the courthouse with the strange sunken lower floor you have to step down into, the foundation that was already old and green when your grandparents were small, the one everyone walks past and no one really looks at, the one that is simply older than the town has any story to explain. I asked you to type it in the comments and hold it in your mind. And if you did, I want you to look at it again now, with everything you have just heard. Because the horror of the Brackwell place is not that one cruel family fed a hungry thing in the dark for 50 years. The horror is everything around that. It is a structure older than the settlement of the continent, sitting under a hillside in West Virginia, built by hands the history books insist were never there. It is a family that came out of nowhere to tend it and was quietly erased from every record that should have caught them. It is a thorough man's report that vanished from a state archive and a scientist's samples that vanished from a laboratory 120 years apart in exactly the same way. It is the slow, patient work of unseen hands keeping certain places off the map and certain pages out of the book, not once, not by accident, but as a practice, across generations, right up into our own century. The Brackwells were keepers, but they were the smallest keepers in this story. The larger keeping, the one that erases the census pages and reassigns the investigators and loses the samples, that one is still going. That one never sealed any door. That one is why you have never heard the name Brackwell until tonight. And the buried lower floors, the impossible old masonry, the structures that were already ancient when the ordinary record begins, they are not only in one hollow in West Virginia. You have walked past them. You have photographed them on vacation and never wondered why the ground floor is under the ground. You typed one into the comments a few minutes ago. Most of them are only old. Most of them are exactly what the plaque says they are. But the whole reason the plaque is so confident, the whole reason the date is so tidy, the whole reason no one ever asks why the oldest building in town is older than the town, is that somebody, somewhere, has spent a very long time making certain the questions stay quiet and the pages stay pressed shut and the empty places stay unfilled. Think for a moment about how a lower floor ends up underground in the first place. The comfortable answer is time. Dirt drifts, streets are raised, 1 century buries the last, slow and ordinary, nobody's fault. And most of the time that answer is true. But stand in front of a building whose first story sits a full floor below the modern street, whose grand front door now opens into packed earth, whose windows look out onto foundations, and ask yourself honestly how many centuries of gentle drifting dust it would take to swallow a whole story of a stone building whole. Then ask why the date on the plaque never seems to account for it. Then ask who wrote the plaque. The Brackwell Hollow is one small buried room at the end of one small buried complex under one nameless hillside, and it took a century and a pipeline and a stubborn scientist to drag even that much into the light before the samples went missing and the door was filled back in. Multiply that by every sunken floor and every impossibly old wall and every building older than the town around it, and you begin to feel the true size of the keeping and to understand that the people who lose the pages and reassign the investigators are not covering up one family in one hollow, they are covering up a floor. A whole floor of the world, built by hands the record insists were never here, and buried, and kept buried, and watched. Ansel Brackwell asked for 100 years. He got them, almost exactly, and then the ground gave up its secret anyway, because that is what buried things do in the end. They surface. The pulse in the valley has been quiet for a long time now. The stair is backfilled, the forest has closed over it, but the wall is still down there, patient as it has always been, and the row of the dead is still one body short, and the empty place is still waiting, in the dark, in the cold, at the bottom of a stair that no map remembers, for the next warm and curious animal to come down and feel, just for a moment, that it has finally found where it was always meant to kneel. Keep an eye on the old buildings. Ask why the first floor is buried, and the next time the ground rings hollow under your feet where it has no business ringing hollow at all, do not send anyone down to find the edge of it. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the buried, the erased, the things the record was built to keep you from asking about, then stay with this channel, because next time we are going down into another place they tried to make certain you would never find. Until then, watch the ground.